Hello, everyone. My name is Atif Rizvi. I am the Executive Director of Conflict and Education Learning Laboratory based in Maastricht. It's called CELL, C-E-L-L. And today's webcast, which is titled From Divisive Stereotypes to Inclusive Identities, the Role of Educational Materials in Crisis and Conflict-Affected Settings, is based on a high-level workshop that we had organized with the support, particularly from ECCN, UNESCO, and our partner in George Eckert Institute of Textbooks in Germany. And during that workshop, which essentially brought together experts and stakeholders to understand the impact of violent pasts on the minds of children and youth, and what are some of the key challenges and good practices, there were two particular outcomes. One major recommendation from people who attended was the need to have a broader geographic focus and have more case studies. And we have brought together for this particular webcast researchers and people who have written documents based on practices from the Netherlands, Belgium, and Uganda. The other major outcome was to have more youth perspectives. And our two researchers who have done research in this domain in Belgium and the Netherlands, in fact, their title is CELL's Young Researchers. Well, without wasting any further time, I'd like to invite our colleague from USAID, Rebecca Martinez, who will join us from Washington, D.C., and will tell us a little bit about the work that is being done at USAID in this domain. Rebecca?
Thank you, Atif, and welcome to all of you again. Thank you for joining us today. Before providing some more detail on some of the work USAID is doing, I did want to provide a brief introduction to ECCN for those of you who might be new. This is really a community of practice that over the past 5 years has provided a forum for experts and practitioners in the field to not only share technical advice, but also to sort of come to an enhanced understanding of what really works for education in crisis and conflict settings. So one of the really important areas of work that we have is partnering with other organizations that are doing cutting-edge research and work in this area. And CELL was selected as one of the 5 partner organizations by ECCN. And this is really because the work that they do around creating and advocating for inclusive materials, specifically textbooks, speaks to a lot of the work that USAID is doing in our different programs. Some of you might be familiar with the Global Book Alliance, which is working towards promoting wider access to stories, to textbooks that are really representative of all children and all communities, as well as the Global Digital Library, where our partners can access those books. There's also been an increased focus on social and emotional learning within USAID, which also connects with a lot of the work that CELL is doing. And for that reason, we're really excited to have them leading this webinar today. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce some of our speakers. Of course, Atif Rizvi will be guiding this conversation. He is the founder and executive director of CELL. Margaret Sinclair is an advisor with CELL and also a recognized expert in the field. Jim Williams is the director of the PhD program in education at George Mason University. And Robert Hakiza, who's joining us from Uganda, is the founder and director of Young African Refugees for Integral Development. And we also have our 2 student researchers, Luca Florin and Arthur Barbosa, joining us today. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Atif to guide our discussion today.
Thank you, Rebecca. Before I ask my first question, I'd like to let everyone know that please do send your questions in the chat box. And once we are done with our primary discussion, we will try to entertain as many questions as possible. And please do forgive us in advance if some of those questions will not be answered because of limited time. So if I may bring in our first distinguished speaker here in Margaret and ask the first question, that what, in your opinion, are some of the constraints towards teaching for inclusive identities in crisis and conflict-affected settings?
In more privileged settings, and then looking at the constraints in low and middle income settings. But across the world, populations have in every country are divided into multiple groups, ethnic, regional, tribal, religious, whatever. And these divisions can sometimes have negative consequences. So to that extent, the textbooks and teaching methods used in Western countries, or industrialized countries, put some effort nowadays into bridging cultural differences. They try to build social cohesion by helping students see all people as equal in humanity and rights. And much teaching practice in the West now involves mixed groups of students using the internet to do projects on global issues, thereby building a sense of inclusiveness and active engagement in global issues or agency, and personal agency, and commitment to making the world a better place. Some schools, for example, in America, have also timetabled social and emotional learning courses. There's quite a range available in the US and also in Europe. And these social emotional learning, or SEL courses, teach empathy, social skills, and among other things, the avoidance of stereotyping explicitly. And one of the points to note is that this social emotional learning has been found in numerous research studies to support academic learning. So it's not an either-or thing. So we know what some of the good things to do in decent income countries, but when we come to low or middle income countries, fragile states, conflict-affected populations, and post-conflict situations, places of concern to ECCN. How can education help prevent conflict? Or how can education prevent a country going back into conflict after the peace has been restored? Because often, I think it's said to be something like 50% of post-conflict situations degenerate into further conflict. The difficulties are just innumerable, and I'm sure most of you know them. A lot of the teachers have had limited education, limited training in pedagogy. They got their job by passing rote learning type exams, and they don't know anything about how to facilitate class discussion. They don't really have that concept or competence. And yet that sort of interpersonal discussion in the class is very important for changing the students' identity, attitudes, and so on. You have very large classes in a lot of countries and very few resources, and often no internet. So we have the problem in many discussions like this that one set of people are saying, let's use the internet to do this and that, and groups to do this and that. And you have other places with no internet and no space to have groups to do things, and no paper and other resources to do group work. So what do we all share? But going back to the constraints, in many countries you have multiple languages. I think in Uganda it's over 50 languages are recognized. So it's very difficult for students to, in the earlier years of schooling in primary school, to actually read. And we know that early grade reading is a weak spot in many systems. So how can we really get to people's hearts and minds if we're asking them to work from things which they don't understand? So it's terribly, terribly challenging. The other aspect is that less trained teachers and all teachers are not too keen about teaching sensitive topics. It can very well be that violent past events or tribal or religious stereotyping are sensitive topics. So if we want to teach against that or about violent past events, it's very sensitive. There's a whole course at the University of London on how to teach sensitive topics.
Margaret, if I may respectfully interrupt for 1 second, and
yes.
Don't lose the train of your thought. And if I would like to bring Robert in here, because Margaret just mentioned that there are 50 or so languages spoken only in Uganda. And Robert, who is in Uganda, would give us a perspective on what's his take on the question, as well as the very insightful comments that Margaret has just made. Robert?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. And I think this is really very, very important because, I remember Margaret she has just said about the languages that we have in Uganda here. I think um, when it comes to the educational materials, whether in textbook or so, have not been always, context based. Like here in Uganda, for instance, in Kampala, where I'm based, when for instance we look at like the situation of so many refugee children who are trying to integrate the Uganda education system, you're going to see that majority of them, for instance, come from these French-speaking countries, where also, apart from the language, there is also this a problem of the education system itself, which is not similar to the one of Uganda here. And when you look at the educational materials that they are used at school, they are not actually reflecting, any reality of, the people who are affected by the conflict. And that this really actually is making it very, very difficult for them, to integrate and to understand whatever is taking place in school. I think if we are offering education in education in emergency situation, it's very important to understand the background of the people you are working with, and whatever the content you are going to design, it will be important to have this background in mind, because what can be designed for instance for refugees may not be necessarily the same as maybe child soldiers, or the one for unaccompanied children may not be the same as survival of GBV. So we need always to look at what's the context and also the reality of the people who are affected by conflict. For instance, like in Kampala here, as I said, 10 years back, there was no an English language curriculum for refugees. So refugees were asked to use the one of like other migrants or students who decided just to come here for the purpose of pursuing their education. And for sure, this did not help many of them to learn English, yet it's very, very important for them. It's only in 2011 that one organization, the Finnish Refugee Council, came up with the idea of producing working books which were more practical and adapted to the situation of refugees. I remember I was one of the team member who worked with the consultant hired by FRC, and we came up with the working book 1 and 2, plus an instructor's guide that emphasizing more on the production of learning materials to help people to capture quickly what the instructors is talking about, but also to reflect the reality of daily life of the refugees.
Thanks so much, Robert. And please, just like Margaret, if you be so kind and not lose the thread, because I'd like to bring in Rebecca in here, because we are talking about educational materials. We are talking about textbooks and inclusivity. So Rebecca, please, your take on this.
Yeah, so I think especially in relation to materials, there's some real practical difficulties. I'll go back to the example of Uganda, where it's somewhere USAID has worked, and we're really trying to promote inclusivity in the early grades through mother tongue instruction, which requires producing all those textbooks in local languages. We know it's about, if we're doing 5 languages, that's about 5 times the cost of doing one language. So beyond maybe some of the social factors, beyond some of the cultural factors, which make it difficult to have textbooks which really reflect inclusivity, there's also just very practical concerns. And one thing that I also wanted to bring up is, as far as just in the wider education space, one difficulty is, of course, that we know that conflict is often preceded by, or one of the results is that there's more inequality in education. So a very basic factor is that there's simply not good representation of all identities, all ethnic groups in a classroom during or after a conflict.
Thank you so much. Jim, as Rebecca just mentioned in terms of the representation of different identities or ethnicities, if you will, would you like to very quickly share your take on this?
Sure. Well, obviously, language is a very important issue, language of presentation, as well as the presentation of images and discussion that includes different groups. Margaret mentioned sensitivity, and that's a very important dimension of this kind of discussion. Another piece of it, I believe, is the role that textbooks, school textbooks, especially history, and that kind of textbook play in the sense of belonging and identity that students are asked to acquire. And it seems to me that that identity can be an inclusive one or an exclusive one. And that is something important to stress. Inclusive shows everyone. Exclusive builds up the sense of belonging and identity by excluding others. And textbooks can go either way with that.
Thank you, Jim. And once again, everyone who has tuned in, please do send in your questions in the chat box, because Ayla Bonfilio, who is the co-founder of CEL, in fact, has been very generous to basically devote her time to take questions from you and put them so that they're in order. And I will move on to the second question, which, of course, I think all the questions that we are talking about here are very important. And this is, how can we improve the connection between learning in the classroom and the everyday reality of conflict and violent pasts? And in this regard, I would really invite our speakers to share their experiences, particularly on good practices, whether it is related to the development of learning materials or the development of new learning configurations between teachers, parents, and students. And I will start with Robert here. So what's your take on that, Robert?
So in reality, what happens in school is that most of the dropped out by refugee children is not only because of the content being delivered by people who are not sensitive or have little understanding of the traumatic experience of being displaced, but also because of the content being focused on the reality of the host community, but not in sake of the need of the refugee children. Like in 2015, so at Yarit, we came up with a project called Bridge to Formal Schooling, which is kind of an accelerated learning that helps refugee children to integrate the Ugandan schools. So we came up with a working document to be used by the teachers in class, but also the teachers were trained to design learning materials translated in different languages, and that reflects the reality of refugee children. So here we came up. The idea was, we came up with the idea of bringing two teachers together. One from the community and one who is a professional teacher from Uganda, who could pair up in the class so that they can help each other, and so that they can support, these children who are either facing the language problem but have difficulties in understanding some of these new things that they are finding here in the Uganda education system. And on top of this, we also came up with the idea of bringing in like two mentors. So the two mentors were there to provide, this additional support, and they could go up to
Just 1 second.
Now they are doing well in school. Yeah.
Robert, 1 second, because the connection was a little bit bad, at least on our end. So I just want to let our people who have tuned in to know that you were basically talking about the
male and female mentors that serve the bridge between the national schools, the refugee teachers, and the local host community for those who couldn't hear your audio, as well as the kind of innovation of your configuration.
Right. And at this point, to respond to this question, I'd like to bring in our young researcher, Luca, who basically worked on good practices for Dutch textbook narration of the Netherlands colonial past. Luca?
Hi, everyone. So I'm one of CEL's researchers, and I looked at how the Dutch colonial past was narrated in Dutch textbooks used in secondary education. And I performed a thematic analysis of the content, and one of the themes I found was taking responsibility. And there were a number of ways in which textbooks or the Dutch educational system as such takes responsibility for past actions. So that could be in terms of the knowledge that they teach students, as well as the skills or competencies that they teach students. So in terms of knowledge, I found that a good practice was that textbooks openly discuss the experiences of the colonized, so that they really openly take ownership of the cruelties that took place. Then also some of the content really explicitly labeled the colonizer as being Dutch, whereas some of the content really generalized to a European level and may in fact risk obscuring the role of the Dutch to a certain degree. Some of the content was really specific and really taught students about the colonial past that is Dutch. And then also in terms of competencies, teaching students to think critically was a main good practice. So this could be, for example, reflecting on the use of certain words, such as the word slave, which is a contested term, and really teaching students to not take for granted the impact of words, and also to present them with kind of past and present critiques of what happened in the past, to kind of ensure that colonized ways of thinking are not continued into the present.
Right. And Jim, particularly your work on how textbooks can promote inclusive identity sort of ties into exactly what Robert said and what Luca has said. So please, your reflections. And then immediately after you, it'll be great if Rebecca can weigh in here on this particular and very important issue.
Sure. Well, Luca and Robert mentioned many of the points that I would make, so I just echo them very briefly. A way of promoting inclusive belonging, showing all of the groups in society as opposed to just the dominant groups, particularly showing the groups that in the past have been erased from portrayal and discussion in history. Teaching multi-perspectivity, the sense that there are different points of view, different understandings of what has happened, and that there's a value in understanding the different approaches, even if one has a different one oneself. Taking responsibility is extremely important. Most countries have some sort of past that they would prefer not to have had, and thinking about that is important. It's also important to focus on the shared ideals and perhaps the way that the past, the difficult past or the contested past has strayed from those ideals and reinforcing the ideals of the society. So in various ways that they both mentioned, those are important steps toward promoting inclusivity.
So I would just highlight here some of the work that USAID has done through the Global Book Alliance, which really speaks to this idea of developing materials from a local perspective and that are inclusive. As I mentioned before, we now have the Global Digital Library, which I encourage you all to Google if you can. And really, one of the main goals is to make sure that everyone has, or all communities have access to materials which are representative both in terms of language, in terms of the characters that are portrayed. For example, there's a whole series of books on Syrian refugees that were developed to be used in the Jordanian classrooms. And it's basic education, so I don't think it necessarily is perhaps quite as direct on some of the heavier issues as James mentioned, but very much there is an attempt to make sure that these materials are developed locally and that they are representative of a wider community.
Thank you all. And that brings me to question number 3, which basically sort of drives off of what stuff that you just raised. That in that case, should the teaching of our violent pasts and contested histories have defined structural guidelines, or should they be flexible? And I would like to bring first our young researcher here, Arthur, who basically will bring in the element of SDG 4.7 where by 2030 to ensure all learners should acquire knowledge and skills, and so on. Arthur?
Yes, hi, thank you, Atif. So to answer this question, I would say that I do think teaching history should remain flexible, because history teaching is very specific to different nations and groups and must be dealt with according to the different contexts. But I also think it's very important to reflect on a broader purpose of teaching history, because in the end, there is a social purpose of teaching history, which is to develop a common identity, whether this identity is of a national nature or more diverse nature. And when I did my research, which looked at focusing on the impact of the content on students' intercultural sensitivity, I needed to have a purpose in mind in order to be able to evaluate the ability of a textbook to foster that purpose. I think at the moment there is this overarching purpose of history education is kind of lacking. And so I suggested in my research using the SDG 4.7, which focuses on fostering global citizenship and cultural appreciation as the social purpose of history. So then my take on the research was to look at whether the textbook I was looking at was contributing to fostering these targets specified in the SDG 4.7. So I don't think I have the expertise to say that the SDG 4.7 is the right purpose of history, but I do think I can confidently say that it is important to agree on a broader purpose of history education, because with this purpose in mind, we can then successfully evaluate and consider history teaching in all countries based on the same standards.
Thank you very much. And Margaret, with all the work that you have done in terms of SEL and your reflections on 4.7 SDG on this, please.
Well, the question is, should we have structural guidelines or be flexible? And I've spent a lot of time in my life drafting guidelines, but we have to be flexible. We have to, in fact, have local context. Guidelines are prepared by a sort of process where you take what's happening locally and you abstract it to the global level, and then you have to put it back, but not just put back the global version, but you have to work with national professionals so that what you put back is locally relevant. So in fact, you have to stimulate local production of stories and other narratives that we can put into textbooks and other education materials in this particular instance. So we have to motivate the students so that they take this on board as something special. We have to distinguish between learning maths and other things to pass an exam and studying this topic because it's going to be important for the personal life and life as a citizen and so on later on. So that's a very difficult distinction to make. My suggestion in recent times has been that we put more emphasis and resources into generating local materials that can have this motivational effect. So taking even real life examples of where different groups work together, for example, in football teams, you often have people from all over the country working together in a national team. And that's very much a model for how we would like countries to integrate the divisions. The other point I was going to mention was, since you asked about social and emotional learning, it's really good if we can teach social and emotional concepts such as avoiding stereotypes, inclusion, not excluding, not being prejudiced, and working in cooperation and so on. This includes, and I'd like to just mention this while we're talking about stereotypes, gender stereotyping and discrimination, which is terribly much a common form of divisive stereotype that's all over the world. So we have to deal with that, and we can learn lessons from the gender movement to see how to create greater interest in divisive pasts and that sort of aspect.
Well, that sort of brings in the notion of the difficulty that comes with how to teach difficult history productively, and so that to lead to dialogue or understanding. And we would very much like Jim to give a brief take on the issue of how we can teach history productively with this sort of difficulty that comes with it.
Well, thank you. It is tricky because sensitive history or difficult history is difficult. And it may be that it's impossible to approach really difficult history in the immediate aftermath. And so it may take a bit of distance, a bit of time to approach that kind of question. Bringing in examples from other places is one strategy, other places and other times. And so the Dutch examination of history, of past history, is probably a good example of ways that countries can look at difficult pasts, but also take responsibility for them after a bit of safe time, and then proceed in that way. That seems a very good example. Facing History, Facing Ourselves is a well-known organization that promotes teaching of difficult history, sometimes through examination of other countries' experience, the Holocaust, genocides, and such. That can be very difficult for young audiences. So the materials the approach need to be age sensitive as well as context sensitive. I doubt it would be possible to have totally universal guidelines, but certainly some indications of the kinds of things that would be important to stress would be worth doing, I think. It's tricky. Teaching difficult history has to be approached with enough safety, enough distance that it can be done. It requires teachers who are able to do that. And so there's no magic bullet that I'm aware of, but moving slowly toward that is the goal. And emphasizing, as Margaret has said, the shared ideals, the shared experience of playing on football, etc.
But since we are talking about shared ideals and the complexity, we're talking about inclusion or exclusion. So that brings us to question number 4, that how can we better include the absent or excluded or omitted individuals and perspectives in these sort of conversations? And it would be great if we can start with Rebecca on this. And the key question, and this was, by the way, one of the key questions that was raised during our workshop in Brussels as well. Rebecca?
Yeah, I think the answer that first comes to mind is really just being very pointed and very prescriptive about including these groups. So making sure that when you're in the process of developing new materials, or you're in discussions about how curriculum is revised, that you are reaching out to and including those groups that have traditionally been omitted. And I think that's a place sometimes where USAID's programming can really bring to the table people who don't always have the chance to advocate for having their perspective included.
Thank you very much. Jim, in this domain, if I may bring in your own personal experience of having grown up in the deep, American South, do you have anything particular to add here?
Well, the U.S., like many places, I think, is probably very much a work in progress on these issues. But there has been a changed, I believe, understanding in many places, many textbooks, many teacher preparation institutions and such, a move away from the history as a listing of wars or accomplishments of white men, great white men, a movement away from simply a heroic narrative to a more complicated narrative of the history, a move away from a single authoritative voice to multiple voices. And so multiple memberships of society, different contributions that different groups have made, some safe but still difficult history to acknowledge, begin the acknowledgement of that. Portrayal of different groups, women, as Margaret mentioned, ethnic groups, a move toward everyday experience as opposed to just the experience of the leaders and of the dominant groups. And so in those various ways, U.S. textbooks, I think, have come quite a ways in dealing with this. Nonetheless, there are topics that are not dealt with well yet, and it's a work in progress.
Thanks, Jim. Luca, your research in particular dealt with the problem of omission. Would you briefly share your research in this regard?
Yes. So one of the themes that I also identified was excluding the colonized, and this examined the multiple ways in which the colonized or formerly colonized were excluded from the narrative. And so the first main finding was that at no point in any of the textbooks the colonized or their descendants were given a direct individual voice. So at all times, the story that was being told or the sources that were being provided were given from the perspective of the colonizer instead of the colonized. So a way in which to kind of potentially solve this would be to maybe interview descendants of the colonized on the existing content, as well as the impact of the use of certain words, for example, such as the use of the word slave, whether this affects them in a certain way. Then also there was some content that was lacking, such as the road to independence in some of the formerly colonized countries. So my suggestion would be to maybe compare textbooks that are used here or in a former colonizers' countries with textbooks that are used in formerly colonized countries, and to see what the differences between them are and how to then maybe potentially fill in the existing gaps in the textbooks that are used here in the Western world.
Thank you. Well, that brings me to the big fifth question. I mean, this discussion is so stimulating that I kind of find it hard to even stop any one of you. But the question number 5 that we have to stimulate this further is that, so where do we go from here? What, in your opinion, would be the next steps, and what is the big tangible objective? And I would like to bring Margaret in for her take on this first, and then we will move on to Robert, and then to Rebecca, and then to Jim. And I would be most grateful if, in respect of time, and to bring in all these wonderful people who have tuned in and they have fantastic questions, that if we could respond to this big thing, but as concisely as possible.
Okay, I'd like to just mention that Professor Williams and I are part of a new network that addresses these issues called Networking to Integrate SDG 4.7 and Social Emotional Learning into educational materials. And we're trying to get out a message to ministries of education and to program managers for education projects and to donors to demand inclusiveness and avoidance of divisive stereotypes in contracts, so that you don't just have a gender inclusiveness clause, but a clause which requires covering all marginalized groups. And the donors who fund a lot of textbook development should require a systematic process that ensures the inclusion of marginalized groups in textbooks, not dictating the content, but ensuring the process includes the marginalized groups. So that's the points that I would like to emphasize, that the people who are actually doing it, funding it, should take this very, very seriously. And we should think how to put this in a way that, they can take on board as institutions.
Robert?
I think we need to acknowledge that, the people who are affected by the conflicts and have their own situation and they have their own history, like what they went through, and that this needs to be taken in consideration in whatever materials and the learning material that is designed, because without that there will be always left behind. And I think when we're designing these learning tools, we need to consider always the aspect of healing, the one of reconciliation, the psychosocial aspects. And the content should address the future aspiration of the learners.
Jim?
Just a quick biographical note as well. I'm actually with George Washington University as opposed to one of the other two Georges in DC, where I'm always explaining, even to my parents, that I teach at George Washington University. A quick, just not that I want to be exclusive about my identity there. I think the next steps for I think it's really important to understand how an inclusive sense of belonging can be taught, maybe from an academic or a research perspective. The SDG 4.7 is a great start, but it may be that some groups need something a little bit more closer to home, and how that closer to home identity can be taught in a way that's inclusive, not built on exclusivity, seems to me a major challenge.
Rebecca?
I would say it's about, the next step is really being very purposeful and promoting diversity in the types of materials that are produced, in the stories that are told, in the viewpoints that are represented in textbooks and storybooks, and then ensuring that there's access to that across for really all communities.
Thank you, and thank you very, very much. So this sort of allows us very naturally into some of the wonderful questions that have been asked by people who have tuned in. And I'll just move on to the first one, which is that when textbooks are revised, often with international donor support, they still reproduce knowledge that contributes towards inequality. Are there instances where post-conflict teaching materials have been transformative and inclusive without reproducing existing biases or inequalities? I think I would like to start with Jim on this and then move on to Rebecca after that, please.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And I think there are isolated examples of that. Certainly, one of the major ones of the last, 70 years was the reconciliation work that Germany, Poland, France did in relation to World War II. Georg Eckert Institute, a partner with CEL, spearheaded a lot of that work. That's somewhat old, but it does represent a gold standard of sorts for textbooks as an instrument of reconciliation. More recently, there are lots of isolated examples, for sure, projects that work to increase understanding across different groups. National textbooks, it's harder to document, but perhaps there are, certainly in terms of gender, there's been a great deal of work to try to make textbooks more gender inclusive, and the language work that's being done, mother tongue instruction and such. So there are examples. Perhaps that's another step forward for academics, would be to document cases of that more thoroughly.
Thanks. Rebecca, before you respond, if I may tie in another question that sort of directly links to this is, and it has been asked by someone from our audience, is that how should or donors like USAID grapple with and balance out often politicized views of subgroups, and what or how inclusiveness is addressed in national curricular materials, particularly in post-conflict settings? So if you could just sort of tailor your response to both questions, because they complement each other. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and I think it varies quite a bit by context, but I would say just generally one thing is something that Margaret referred to earlier, and that's just having very clear standards and very clear guidelines about how we are going to approach to some of these difficult issues. I think issues around gender and disability are ones that are really clearly outlined for USAID as far as how those need to be represented in any materials that are partially funded or fully funded by us. I think also there's been a lot of work around textbooks and curriculum that promotes peace building. I can think of South Sudan as one particular example where in a post-conflict context, there was a lot of work around developing materials and training teachers to teach and to promote skills, and also provide content that would help bring groups together.
Thank you. And, I feel absolutely horrible saying that, but we are running short of time. So we will take one more question for responses. And I feel that I'm really shortchanging myself here, which is that to what extent can you build, or can we build, understanding of history by having pupils construct the history of their own communities, bringing in stories of their families, and bringing forth both areas of conflict and ways of mediating peace, so they become aware of how history is created. And I would like to have Robert respond to this first, and then Arthur, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the first problem that we're facing in Africa here is that, there is no, we need to acknowledge that Africa has its own history, both written and oral. When we look at, most of these people affected by conflicts, I think they need to be given, the chance to tell their story. I think this is really very important. Sometimes I feel they need to be given that chance, because they feel very comfortable when, people are hearing their story, and they also at the same time try to it's actually also help with the healing some of these problems and the situation where this bad experience that went through. I think that is really very, very important, to be given the chance to tell their stories and the people are hearing.
Arthur?
Yes, I think it's a very good question. I would add that when I did my focus group discussion in a high school in Belgium, in the suburbs of Brussels, which is quite a segregated area with regards to, there's a lot of privileged children and mostly from a white background. And what I could see is that they were reading the narrative of Belgium's colonial past. And because they were all Belgian, nobody was challenging this narrative, meaning that in all the discussion, you never had the perspective of the colonized or of a Congolese person or an African person challenging what was being said in the textbook or changing what was being said by the other students. So I would indeed say it would be very important to make sure that the different perspectives are present, not only in the textbook, but also in the classroom among the different students.
Thank you very much. But may I kindly ask Margaret, and then Jim, and then Rebecca, and all three of you have 60 seconds each. But it would be great if you can somehow respond to this wonderful question here in that time, please. Margaret?
I'll just slightly deviate. We have teachers from and students in a country from all sides of a conflict and various divisions. So we have, for national textbooks and curriculum and exams, we have to have something which is acceptable to them all. And that's why I'm pushing for positive, inclusive examples of people looking to the future, building their society, as a remedy to cope with these issues.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I would echo Margaret's thoughts in that it's certainly important to have students acknowledge and build their own history. There's also this need for a greater understanding and for some sort of general accepted narrative, but it has to include multiple viewpoints, and it has to be something that's constructed with a lot of different voices at the table.
Jim?
Well, the example or the description that the question posed mirrors very closely the work done by Prime in Israel, Palestine, and very interesting example, which was very important work and also didn't gain a larger legitimacy, unfortunately. But it's a good example. I would add to the developing of one's own history and one's own story, the development of a national history and a national understanding, which students could also do across ethnic and other divides.
Oh, Rebecca, would you kindly raise one question which sort of, and for you, Jim, which in fact sort of like a response almost to what you just said, which is that some countries with central national curriculum frameworks have allocated part of the curriculum for local level development. Can he, so basically, and the lady or gentleman who has asked this question said that, can any one of you actually comment on this, especially regarding history, but also geography? So perhaps Rebecca first and then Jim again, please.
Yeah, I think that's actually, and I'm speaking here more to basic education materials versus textbooks in high school, but the solution that we found to work well in some cases, not in all, is to work at the local level and the regional level, because there you're going to find, a greater understanding of that community, and the voices at the table are going to be the ones of the local people.
Well, brings me to close this session in the sense that we heard some wonderful and very insightful stuff in the sense of taking responsibility is very important, and history should be taught in a more flexible manner, or perhaps that there is a broader purpose to teaching history which should be taken into account. And of course, the debate between local versus more national towards more international, and the stories and narratives that we should cover. And to sort of wrap up this session, I would like to invite Rebecca to sort of sum up what has been said here. Thank you.
Thank you, Atif, and thank you to all of those that joined us today. I hope this was really a rich discussion for all of you, and that it, brought highlighted not only some best practices, but also really brought to surface some thought-provoking questions. I know that I'm taking away from it really the importance of actively reaching out to those communities who are marginalized for different reasons, be it refugees, be it by gender, be it disability, and including them not only in the process of developing materials, but I think more widely in developing a narrative about history, about the stories that are sort of nationally unifying, and ensuring that all viewpoints are represented in the materials that are then put into classrooms, because we know that that is really powerful, not only in terms of education, but also in terms of shaping young people's perspectives throughout life. So again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. There will be more youth perspectives coming from the Cell Partner in our latest ECCN newsletter. And if any of you are new to ECCN and would like to continue to be involved in these webinars and join our community of practice, please feel free to register at the link provided on the slide. And we look forward to seeing all of you in the future. Thank you very much for joining us. And with that, I will end this webinar.